What happens when a live television interview goes from polite smiles to icy silence in less than 10 seconds, and the entire studio feels the temperature drop? It was supposed to be routine. A prime time segment. Bright lights. Applause on cue. A celebrity seated comfortably across from a confident host. The kind of moment producers replay in highlight reels. But that night, something was different. Something unspoken hovered in the air, like a storm building behind a blue sky. Before we dive in, if you love intense, cinematic live narratives like this, make sure you subscribe to Live Narratives, hit that like button, and drop a comment below. Because tonight's story, it's one you won't forget. The cameras were already rolling when the tension began to brew. He walked out with effortless composure, the crowd rising in applause. A practiced smile. A firm handshake. The host leaned forward with that familiar on-air warmth, the kind that feels genuine but is measured down to the second. Compliments were exchanged. Laughter followed. The audience relaxed. But beneath the laughter, there was a subtle shift. "Thank you for being here tonight," the host said, eyes sharp despite the smile. "Wouldn't miss it," he replied smoothly, crossing one leg over the other. Calm. Confident. The early questions were safe. A recent project. A new venture. A brief joke about headlines. He answered easily, voice steady, gaze direct. The audience clapped at the right moments. Everything was flowing. And then it happened. The host tilted her head slightly. The kind of gesture that signals a pivot. "There's been a lot of conversation lately," she began carefully, "about your recent comments. Some people feel they were dismissive. Even hurtful." The air shifted. He blinked once. Slowly. "Conversation?" he repeated, voice still calm. "Or controversy?" A ripple moved through the audience. Not loud. Not obvious. But there. The host didn't back down. "Several public figures have criticized you. They say you crossed a line." Silence. He leaned back, exhaling softly through his nose. For a split second, the mask slipped, not into anger, but into something sharper. Calculation. "I find it interesting," he said quietly, "how quickly narratives are created, especially when they're convenient." A few audience members clapped nervously. Others exchanged glances. The host's smile tightened. "So, you're saying the criticism isn't valid?" "I'm saying," he replied, leaning forward now, elbows resting on his knees, "that context matters. And context doesn't trend as well as outrage." That line landed. You could almost hear social media typing in real time. The host paused, choosing her next words carefully. But when millions of people hear something the same way at some point, does a responsibility fall on the speaker? The audience murmured. This wasn't playful banter anymore. This was an edge. His jaw flexed. "Responsibility," he echoed. "I take responsibility for what I say. Not for how it's edited. Not for how it's clipped. And definitely not for how it's twisted." Applause. Louder this time. The host straightened in her chair. "Are you suggesting media outlets twisted your words?" He didn't hesitate. "I'm suggesting that controversy sells. A beat. And tonight," he added, eyes locking onto hers, "we're selling pretty well." Gasps. A few laughs. One sharp clap from somewhere in the back. The tension had officially arrived. Behind the scenes, producers exchanged glances. This wasn't in the pre-interview notes. The questions had been discussed. The tone had been agreed upon. But live television has its own heartbeat, and tonight it was racing. The host tried to regain control. "Let's be clear," she said firmly. "The concerns came from your own statements. No edits." "Then play the full statement," he replied immediately. "All of it. Not 10 seconds." The audience reacted audibly now. Some cheering. Some shaking their heads. The host's expression hardened just slightly. "We don't have that clip prepared." He raised an eyebrow. Convenient. There it was. The word that cracked the surface. The atmosphere thickened. Even the studio lights felt hotter. For a moment, neither spoke. Just eye contact. Just silence. The kind of silence that feels louder than shouting. Finally, the host broke it. "Let me ask you directly. Do you regret what you said?" He inhaled slowly. The question hung in the air like a suspended blade. "No," he said. The single word echoed. "But," he continued, voice lowering, "I regret that people felt hurt. That was never the intention." A softer murmur moved through the crowd. The host leaned in. "Intent doesn't erase impact." "And impact," he replied, "doesn't erase intent." The audience split, half clapping, half stunned. This wasn't a meltdown. It wasn't shouting. It was something more dangerous. Controlled confrontation. You could see it in their eyes. Neither one wanted to blink first. The host adjusted her papers, though she didn't look down at them. Some would argue that with your platform comes a greater obligation to be careful. "And I am careful," he said evenly. "Careful not to let fear dictate what I say. Careful not to apologize just because it's trending." That line sent a shockwave. A few audience members audibly gasped. The host's voice sharpened. "So, you believe the backlash is just trending outrage?" "I believe," he said slowly, deliberately, "that outrage is the currency of the moment." The room was electric now. Cameras zoomed slightly closer. The control room was silent except for rapid whispers. This wasn't a standard segment anymore. It was a standoff. The host tried one more angle. "If someone watching tonight feels personally hurt by your words, what would you say to them?" For the first time, he paused longer than a breath. His gaze shifted from the host to the audience, to the camera, to the millions beyond it. "I'd say," he began, voice softer now, "I'm human. I speak from my perspective. I'm open to dialogue. But I won't be bullied into silence." Thunderous applause from one side. Uneasy silence from the other. The divide was visible. The host nodded slowly, lips pressed together. "Dialogue," she repeated. "That's what we're doing here." "Is it?" he asked quietly. Another beat of silence. The question lingered. Was this dialogue, or was it a televised cross-examination? The audience felt it. You could see people leaning forward in their seats, phones discreetly recording. This would be clipped, shared, debated, torn apart. And we were only halfway through the segment. The host glanced toward the camera, then back at him. "We're going to take a short break." Translation. The control room needed a breath. As the applause sign lit up and the theme music swelled, their smiles returned, thin, professional, controlled. But up close, if you looked carefully, you could see it. Neither one was finished. Not even close. Because what happens when the break ends, when producers whisper new instructions, when pride and perception collide under unforgiving studio lights? That's when the real confrontation begins. The applause faded faster than it should have. As the theme music carried the show into commercial break, the studio lights dimmed just slightly, but the tension didn't. If anything, it thickened. The audience shifted in their seats, whispering to one another, phones already buzzing with half-written posts they were itching to send. Some faces showed excitement. Others discomfort. Everyone sensed it. This wasn't just television anymore. This was a moment. Off camera, a producer hurried toward the host, whispering urgently, her hand half covering her mouth. The host nodded without looking away from her guest. Her smile stayed frozen in place, but her jaw tightened. The guest, meanwhile, sat back, hands clasped loosely, eyes fixed forward as if nothing unusual had happened. Calm. Almost too calm. "You good?" someone off stage asked him quietly. He didn't answer. Just nodded once. The countdown began. Fingers raised. 3, 2. The lights surged back to full brightness. "And we're back," the host said smoothly, turning toward the camera with practiced ease. "Thank you for staying with us." Applause followed, less enthusiastic than before, more uncertain. The audience didn't know whether to clap or brace. The host pivoted toward her guest. "Before the break, we were talking about responsibility and dialogue." He smiled faintly. "We were talking about honesty." A ripple of reaction swept through the crowd. She ignored it. "I want to read something," she said, lifting a card from her stack. "This is a quote from you. No edits. No clips." He raised his eyebrows. "I'm listening." She read it aloud, word for word. The sentence hung in the air, sharp, provocative, stripped of tone but heavy with implication. The audience murmured immediately. Someone in the front row shook their head. Another person clapped once, then stopped. She lowered the card. Do you understand why people reacted strongly to that? He nodded slowly. I understand why it sounds harsh when isolated. So, it was harsh, she pressed. It was direct, he corrected. There's a difference. The host leaned forward. Directness doesn't excuse harm. And sensitivity, he replied, doesn't require censorship. The audience reacted louder now. A mix of applause and groans collided, overlapping in a chaotic chorus. The host's voice sharpened just a notch. No one's asking you to be censored. They're asking you to be accountable. He let out a short breath, almost a laugh. Accountable to whom? To the people affected, she said immediately. And who decides they're affected? He shot back. A headline? A hashtag? The room erupted. The applause sign didn't even need to light up. The host raised her hand slightly, trying to regain control. This isn't about hashtags. This is about real people. So am I, he said, meeting her gaze. And I don't get to stop being real just because it makes people uncomfortable. The host paused, eyes narrowing just enough to be noticeable. Do you think discomfort is always productive? I think, he replied carefully, it's often necessary. That line landed like a spark in dry air. The audience leaned in again, fully engaged now. This was no longer passive viewing. This was a collision of worldviews, unfolding live. The host tried another approach, her tone shifting, softer, more personal. Have you spoken privately to anyone who said they were hurt? He hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Yes, he said. And those conversations looked nothing like this. The implication stung. This, she said slowly, is also a conversation. Is it? He repeated, echoing his earlier question. Or is it a performance? A collective gasp swept through the studio. The host straightened, her composure hardening. Are you accusing us of staging outrage? I'm accusing the system, he said evenly, of rewarding it. The silence that followed was heavy, deliberate. Somewhere off stage, a producer whispered urgently into a headset. The host didn't look away. Let's talk about consequences, she said. Your words influence people. Young people. Do you accept that? I accept influence, he replied. I reject the idea that influence means obedience. The audience reacted again. Louder, more divided than ever. One woman near the aisle stood halfway, then sat back down, conflicted. Another person shouted something unintelligible before being quickly hushed. The host exhaled slowly. So, where's the line? He leaned forward, elbows on his knees again, mirroring his earlier posture. The line is honesty without malice. And who decides what's malicious? She asked. He met her stare. Intent. She shook her head. Impact. They said it almost simultaneously. The collision of words echoed. The audience burst into applause, some laughing nervously at the symmetry, others clapping hard in approval. For a brief moment, even the host seemed surprised. Then she recovered. You see, she said, that right there. That's the divide. And maybe, he replied quietly, it's one worth examining instead of exploiting. That did it. The applause was immediate and thunderous from one side of the room. The other side remained tense, arms crossed, faces tight. The host waited it out, then spoke with measured calm. You're suggesting that people are using this controversy for attention. I'm suggesting, he said, that outrage has become a shortcut to relevance. The host's lips pressed into a thin line. And you're immune to that? He smiled faintly. No one's immune, but I won't pretend otherwise. The honesty shifted something in the room. The host softened again, sensing it. Then let me ask you this, she said. If you could say one thing differently, would you? The audience went quiet. This was the question, the one that could de-escalate everything. He thought for a long moment. The cameras stayed tight on his face. You could almost hear people holding their breath. Yes, he said finally. A murmur rippled. I would have said it slower, he continued, and I would have insisted it be heard in full. The host studied him. That's not an apology. No, he agreed. It's an explanation. The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was unsettled. The host nodded slowly. Sometimes, she said, people need more than explanations. And sometimes, he replied gently, explanations are the first step. For the first time since the segment began, neither of them spoke immediately. The tension hadn't disappeared, but it had shifted. Less sharp, more complex. The audience sensed it too, but complexity doesn't trend. And as the host glanced briefly toward the camera, then back to her guest, one thing was clear. This conversation wasn't cooling down. It was evolving. And evolution under live television lights can be just as explosive. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. Something had changed after that last exchange. The room no longer felt like a battlefield divided cleanly down the middle. It felt unstable, like a fault line under pressure. The kind where the next movement could either settle everything or crack it wide open. The host adjusted in her chair, glancing briefly toward the camera, then back at him. Her tone was calmer now, but there was steel beneath it. Let's talk about power, she said. Because whether you like it or not, you have it. A murmur rippled through the audience. He nodded once. I won't deny that. With power, she continued, comes responsibility. Not just for intent, but for outcomes. He tilted his head. Outcomes you can't fully control? Outcomes you can influence, she corrected. The audience leaned forward again, sensing another climb. Let me ask you something, he said, voice steady. Do you believe silence is safer than honesty? The host didn't answer immediately. I believe, she said carefully, that words can wound. And silence, he replied, can rot. That line hit harder than the others. A sharp intake of breath swept through the crowd. Someone whispered, wow. The host blinked, then straightened. That sounds poetic, she said, but it doesn't comfort someone who feels targeted. Neither does pretending discomfort equals danger, he replied. Applause burst out, strong, immediate, followed by scattered boos. The divide was back, sharper than before. The host raised her voice slightly, not shouting, but firm. You keep framing this as discomfort. What if it's more than that? He leaned back, eyes narrowing just a touch. Then let's define it, because vague harm is impossible to address. The audience reacted loudly, some nodding, others shaking their heads. You want definitions? She said. Fine. Let's talk about the people who say your words made them feel unseen. Dismissed. He didn't interrupt. He listened. That alone shifted the energy. And when those voices spoke up, she continued, they were met with mockery, with sarcasm, with your supporters laughing it off. He exhaled slowly. I can't control how others respond. But you can set the tone, she countered. The room went quiet. That one landed closer to home. He looked down for a brief moment, barely a second, but the camera caught it. The audience caught it. Then he looked back up. You're right, he said. A gasp rippled through the studio. The host froze, just for a fraction of a second. I can set the tone, he continued. And maybe I underestimated how loud it would echo. The audience erupted. This time, the applause was overwhelming. Even some who had been tense earlier were clapping now. The host nodded slowly. That matters. But, he added, raising a finger slightly, that doesn't mean I'll abandon my point just to soften the echo. The applause faltered, then split again. The host smiled thinly. There it is. There it is, he echoed, almost amused. The crowd laughed nervously. She leaned forward. Do you see how hard it is for people to hear accountability followed immediately by resistance? Yes, he said. And do you see how hard it is to be accountable in a culture that demands surrender? The temperature rose again. The host crossed her legs, posture tightening. You keep talking about culture, but this is about you. And you keep talking about me, he replied, as if I exist outside that culture. A sharp clap rang out from the audience. The host inhaled. Let me put this plainly. Do you think people are too sensitive right now? The question dropped like a match. The audience audibly reacted, some groaning, others leaning forward eagerly. He didn't rush the answer. I think, he said slowly, people are overwhelmed. A beat. And when people are overwhelmed, he continued, they look for villains because villains make chaos feel organized. The room went still. Even the host seemed taken aback. That's a dangerous framing, she said quietly. So, is pretending everyone who disagrees with you is malicious, he replied. The silence that followed was thick enough to press against the walls. Somewhere in the audience, a phone buzzed. Someone else whispered, this is wild. The host broke the pause. Do you see yourself as the villain here? He smiled faintly. I see myself as a convenient one. The reaction was explosive. Applause thundered. Boos followed. Someone shouted something unintelligible before being quickly hushed again. The host lifted her hand. We need to keep this respectful. I agree, he said immediately. Which is why I'm still here. That line drew a mix of laughter and applause. The host leaned back, studying him. You know what people are saying online right now? He nodded. I can imagine. They're calling this a masterclass in deflection, she said bluntly. And others, he replied, are calling it the first honest conversation they've seen in a while. The audience reacted again, split clean down the middle. The host sighed softly. This is exactly the problem. Or, he said gently, exactly the point. For a moment, neither spoke. The camera pulled back slightly, revealing the audience in full. Faces lit with excitement, frustration, curiosity. Everyone was feeling something. No one was indifferent. The host tried one more angle, her voice quieter now. Do you worry, she asked, that moments like this harden people instead of opening them? He considered it. Yes, he said honestly. But I worry more about pretending fractures don't exist. The room hummed with tension. She nodded slowly. So where does that leave us? He looked around the studio, then back at her. In the middle of it, a strange laugh escaped someone in the audience. The host glanced toward the camera again. We're running out of time. Funny, he replied softly. That always seems to happen when things get uncomfortable. The audience laughed louder this time. The host smiled despite herself. Final question before we move on. The room held its breath. If this conversation continues beyond tonight, she said, are you willing to listen as much as you speak? He didn't hesitate. Yes. The simplicity of the answer caught everyone off guard. And, he added, I hope others are willing to do the same. The applause that followed was sustained, complex, layered with emotion rather than certainty. As the clapping faded, the host nodded. We'll see. But the look in her eyes said something else. This wasn't over. Not for them. Not for the audience. Not for the millions watching, typing, arguing, choosing sides in real time. Because what had started as an interview had turned into something far more dangerous. A mirror. And not everyone likes what they see when the lights are this bright. The mirror lingered. Even as the applause faded, its reflection stayed suspended in the air, uncomfortable, unresolved. The host shifted her papers, more out of habit than need. The guest remained still, hands folded, eyes forward. The audience sensed it too. This wasn't the winding down of a segment. It was the inhale before another plunge. The host cleared her throat. We have a few minutes left, she said, voice measured. I want to use them carefully. A nervous laugh rippled through the crowd. Careful hasn't really been the theme tonight, he replied quietly. Some laughed. Others winced. She met his gaze. Careful doesn't mean safe. He nodded once. Fair. The studio felt smaller now. Closer. As if the walls had leaned in to listen. I want to read something else, the host said, lifting her tablet. This is from someone who watched you speak and felt diminished. She read the message slowly, deliberately. Each word carried weight. Pain. Frustration. A sense of being talked over rather than talked to. As she read, the audience grew quiet. No murmurs. No reactions. Just listening. When she finished, she looked up. What would you say to them? He didn't respond immediately. His jaw tightened, not defensively, thoughtfully. I'd say, he began, that being heard doesn't always feel good at first. And neither does hearing. The audience stirred. But he continued, voice softer now. If my words made you feel smaller, that wasn't my goal. And I'm listening to that. The shift was real this time. You could feel it. The host nodded slowly. Listening is active, she said. It requires change. Sometimes, he agreed. And sometimes it requires patience. She exhaled through her nose, considering that. Do you think patience is a luxury some people don't have? Yes, he said without hesitation. And I think urgency can distort truth. A low murmur swept the room. The host leaned forward again. So, what's more important to you right now, being right or being understood? The question landed heavy. He looked at her, then at the audience, then finally at the camera. Being understood, he said. A few claps started, tentative, hopeful, then grew louder. But, he added, holding up a hand, understanding can't come from silence or fear. The applause fractured again. The familiar divide returned, though softer now, like a bruise instead of a wound. The host smiled faintly. You really can't help yourself. He smiled back. I don't want to. The audience laughed, tension breaking just a little. Let me be direct, she said. Do you think tonight helped or hurt? He thought for a moment. Both. She raised an eyebrow. Explain. I think it helped people see the fracture, he said. And it hurt, because fractures hurt to look at. The room fell into a contemplative quiet. That's not an answer producers love, she said. He chuckled softly. Truth rarely is. The host glanced briefly off camera, then back. We're getting messages, she said. A lot of them. The audience buzzed. Some are thanking you, she continued. Others are furious. He nodded. That tracks. Does that concern you? She asked. Yes, he said. But not for the reasons people think. She waited. It concerns me, he continued, that we've forgotten how to disagree without dehumanizing. A few scattered claps followed. Someone whispered, That's true. The host folded her hands. And yet, she said, your tone tonight, some would say it was provocative. Provocation, he replied calmly, is often just honesty without padding. The audience reacted again, this time with a mix of laughter and sighs. She shook her head slightly. You're very comfortable being misunderstood. No, he said softly. I'm just not afraid of it. That line settled in the room like dust after a collapse. The host studied him for a long beat. You know, she said, this isn't the conversation people expected. It's the one we needed, he replied. The audience applauded. Longer, steadier now. The host smiled, genuine this time. I don't know if I agree. He smiled back. I know. The laughter that followed was warm, almost relieving. But beneath it, the tension still hummed. The host glanced at the clock. We're almost out of time. A collective groan rose from the crowd. She turned to him. Final thought. One sentence. He inhaled, then spoke clearly. Discomfort isn't the enemy, dishonesty is. The reaction was immediate and loud. Applause, cheers, a few dissenting shouts, all colliding into one chaotic sound. The host let it play out, then raised her hand. Thank you for being here. Thank you for having me, he replied. They shook hands again, firm, professional, but this time it felt different. Less performative. More earned. As the applause swelled and the camera pulled back, the audience rose to their feet. Not all of them, but enough to make a statement. Some clapped in support. Some clapped out of respect for the moment itself. Some remained seated, arms crossed, eyes thoughtful. The lights dimmed slightly as the show prepared to move on. But the energy didn't leave. Because everyone in that room knew the truth. The conversation didn't end when the cameras cut. It was just about to escape into the world. The cameras cut, but the moment didn't. For a split second after the red light went dark, there was an eerie stillness in the studio, like everyone was waiting for permission to breathe again. Then the room exhaled all at once. Voices overlapped. Chairs scraped. Applause turned into conversation, debate, disbelief. The host removed her microphone, nodding politely to the audience, her professional smile still in place. but her eyes told a different story. Focused.
Processing.
Already replaying the exchange in her mind. The guest stood slowly, adjusting his jacket. A producer approached immediately, speaking in hushed tones. He listened, nodded once, said nothing. Calm on the outside. Inside, the adrenaline still pulsed. Audience members clustered in small groups, arguing in whispers that weren't really whispers. He was right. No, he dodged everything. At least he didn't fake it. That was uncomfortable but honest. Phones were already up. Clips were already being trimmed. The quotes were already stripped of context and hurled into the void. By the time he stepped off the stage, the internet had caught fire. Within minutes, his name was trending. Short clips flooded every platform. 10 seconds here, 12 seconds there. The most confrontational moments rose to the top. The pauses, the sharp lines, the word convenient. The question, is this dialogue or performance? Supporters hailed it as bravery. Finally, someone said it. Critics called it arrogance. Textbook deflection. Commentators rushed in with hot takes before the credits even finished rolling. By the time the host reached her dressing room, her phone was vibrating nonstop. Messages from colleagues, producers, friends. Are you okay? That escalated fast. You held your ground. She sat down, stared at her reflection in the mirror, and for the first time that night, let the smile fade. She hadn't lost control, but she hadn't controlled the narrative either. And maybe that was the most unsettling part. Across the city, the guest sat in the back of a car, city lights streaking past the window. His phone buzzed relentlessly. He didn't check it. Not yet. He knew what he'd find.
Praise.
Rage. Misinterpretation. The cost of speaking without a safety net. Later that night, opinion pieces began to drop. Some praised the confrontation as one of the most honest, live moments in years. Others condemned it as a failure of accountability wrapped in eloquence. The next morning, the headlines clashed just as violently as the audience had. Viewers divided after explosive interview. A necessary conversation, or a dangerous one? Live TV moment that exposed a cultural fault line. Clips replayed on morning shows.
Panels argued.
Social media lines were drawn deeper. But something else happened too, quieter, harder to quantify. People talked. Not in slogans. Not just in outrage. But in long threads. Late-night conversations. Messy, uncomfortable debates that didn't end neatly. Some viewers admitted they'd changed their minds. Others doubled down. Many said the same thing. I didn't agree with everything, but I couldn't stop watching. And that was the aftermath no one could fully control. Because the moment wasn't clean. It wasn't safe. It didn't offer a clear villain or a clear hero. It offered a fracture. A live, unscripted collision that forced everyone watching to choose, not a side, but a level of honesty they were willing to tolerate. Days later, the host addressed the moment briefly on air.
Calm.
Measured. Conversations like that are uncomfortable, she said. But they reflect where we are. The guest posted a single message online. No apology. No defense. Still listening. The comments exploded. And somewhere between the noise and the silence, the truth settled in. That night wasn't about winning. It was about being seen, flaws, resistance, humanity, and all, under unforgiving lights. Now it's your turn. What do you think? Was it accountability, deflection, or something more complicated? Did the conversation help or hurt? Drop your opinion in the comments. I want to hear where you stand. And if you want more explosive, cinematic live moments like this, stories that don't flinch, don't soften, and don't look away, make sure you subscribe to Live Narratives. Because the most powerful confrontations don't end on television. They begin there.